I'm glad that I'm doing my first video game review, and what better game to do it than a game that you might not have heard of unless you've been watching my channel and watching my Let's Plays. The game is called Soma. Now, Soma is a science fiction horror game brought to you by Frictional Games, which brought you Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Now, I haven't really played Amnesia because it's more of a computer thing, and, well, I don't have a very good computer for gaming. And I believe just like Amnesia, you play in first person, and it's a survival horror thing where you gotta hide and run away from the monsters. In Soma, you play as Simon, who is a Canadian, and he has unfortunately been in a car accident. This car accident killed his friend, and unfortunately he is terminally ill. You see, because of the accident, his brain continually starts bleeding, especially in very stressful situations. And so he hears about this experimental medical procedure where they can scan his brain, use that scan to do all these different sorts of tests and try to figure out a cure before actually applying it to his own brain. Simon goes in for a scan, and next thing you know, he wakes up in a totally different environment right after the brain scan. Instead, now he's in what seems to be an abandoned underwater facility full of experiments and crazy robots out to kill him, as well as some robots that creepily think they're human. Along the way of trying to get out of the facility, he discovers some really crazy things about the world he lives in. And he manages to get into contact with what appears to be the only human left alive, named Catherine. And together they embark on a way to save mankind. Now, I don't want to give any more detail than that for the story, because there's a lot of twists, a lot of turns, a lot of really interesting things that I don't want to spoil. Just know that the story of the game was by far my favorite part of this game. It's what ultimately kept me going throughout the playthrough. If it didn't have as much of an interesting story as this one does, then I might not have liked this game as much as I do. The story really excels at being a science fiction horror. There's a lot of scientific elements, there's a lot of science fictional theories that are really intriguing, a lot of conversations between Simon and Catherine that question consciousness and question the scientific aspects of what's happening in this world. And I think the most horrific thing about the game is some of the elements of the story rather than the actual monsters that are chasing you. Yes, the monsters are creepy, they are scary when you actually come across them. But I think some of the most horrific elements of the game come from the fact that some of these robots think they're human. Some of these robots have human consciousness within them. And if you think about it, some of the monsters are probably just robots with human consciousness where the human consciousness could not cope with their new robot body and have gone completely insane. And there's a few elements of these robot bodies that made me feel like they're in frickin' purgatory, and I think some of that helps to the horror element more so than the monsters themselves. Now, as great as the story is, it's nowhere near flawless. There's some philosophical questions and scientific questions and theories that happen between Simon and Catherine's interactions. And while this makes the story really interesting, sometimes it's a little forced and it feels like Simon shouldn't be able to talk about this kind of stuff or be intelligent enough to talk about this stuff. Also, figuring out the backstory of all these different facilities that you go through is dependent on what you find as the player. All this information comes from scattered notes all across the facilities, being able to read the minds of the people that are dead or what they last thought of before they died, and being able to listen to the last radio conversations of different computers and different databases. And so sometimes if you don't find all the things you need to understand the backstory of all these different facilities and the characters that used to be alive, well then you'll miss out on some of the backstory and some things might be confusing. And even when you do find all the elements that you can get for the backstory, it still is scattered and incomplete. There's definitely a bunch of holes that you have to figure out yourself and connect the pieces yourself. Also, Simon's friend who died in the car crash, it feels like at the beginning she's going to be an important role because Simon obviously feels guilty for the wreck and her dying, and she was a friend. Maybe even a girlfriend. It's not quite clear who she was, if it was a friend or more than that. But then the game just sort of forgets about her and then randomly has her in a dream sequence, and then it never comes up ever again. And something feels missing with that plot line or that subplot. This is a first-person game and very similar to Outlast or Amnesia or Alien Isolation. Except you get no guns and you can't even hide in lockers. There's no way to fight these creatures and no way to hide from them unless you get out of their sight. But those of you that have played all three of those games might be a little bit more disappointed in Soma, because even though your first playthrough, everything is creepy because you don't know when the monsters are going to show up. But if you've played the game and then you play it again, you realize that there's only certain sections where the monsters can actually attack you. There's very few moments where you're actually completely in danger. It's definitely not as intense as Outlast, Alien Isolation, or I'm guessing Amnesia. I haven't played Amnesia, but I've heard really great things about it. Now, there are 5 different monsters throughout this game in different sections of the facility. Each one is unique. They have a different design. But the ones that stand out for me are the first 3 because they're very different from the last 2 types. The first type is this big, bulky robot that is very different from the other ones that are more humanoid. The second and the third creatures really stand out because you have to have a certain technique in order to get past them. The second creatures you find, you can't look at them, otherwise they sort of teleport towards you and blast out an EMP or something like that. Which is bad because you're underwater and you're in a diving suit. And so you have to keep from looking at them in order to get past them, which is kind of creepy. And then the third creature only hunts you by sound, and so you have to stay really quiet and stay crouched throughout the entire time. But even if you're crawling really close to it, it can still hear you, so be extremely careful with those things. Also, unlike these other games, it's not a one-hit kill. And there's no difficulty setting, so you can't really make it easier or harder. It just is that difficulty. There's very few times where I actually saw the "you died" screen in the game, because what happens is when you're initially hit, you just sort of black out and then you wake up in the same spot, but the creature is a little further away, giving you time to get past it.
Jesus Christ! What the hell?
It is a bit of a puzzle game, and you have to figure out how to bring power to certain stations and deal with some other stuff, but they're never really too difficult, and you can breeze past some of them as long as you think clearly and think out of the box sometimes. But they're still nowhere as easy as the puzzles from Resident Evil 4 or something like that. Sorry, I have to bring up Resident Evil 4. It's just whenever there's a survival horror and I think of easy puzzles, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Thankfully, the game doesn't really focus on jump scares. There's a few jump scares, but not enough to feel like it's completely relying off of it or that it's even the major contribution to the scares. There's a lot of atmosphere, there's a lot of creepiness, there's a lot of creepy creatures. Like I said, some of the more horrific things about the game is the story and you coming across some of these characters that truly believe that they're human even though they're robots.
Are you human?
Shit, did my body give it away? I try hard to save a mystery. Yeah, I'm human. Are you?
My name is Simon. Do you know anything about this place?
Oh, you knew. That makes us slightly less weird. Look, I'm obviously hurt. If you see anyone else around, just tell them where I am.
Well, where are you exactly?
Are you for real? I'm right here. See me waiting? Look at my hands. Hey, buddy. okay?
Okay. I'm just gonna be. I'm not seeing it. I see a machine, a robot talking.
What the hell are you looking at? I'm here. See?
Sure, it could be comical a little bit, but sometimes it's actually genuinely creepy and horrific and sad. Graphically, I think the environments are really beautiful. Yes, they have a dark and creepy element, especially when you're inside the facilities. But when you're underwater, it combines something that's beautiful and terrifying at the same time with all this coral, the wow growing over everything, and there's just some things that I was just in awe of. The character models, however, aren't the greatest, but they don't feel like something that you would expect from last gen. It's still this gen, but just not that great as some of the other games that have come out in recent years. It is also a little strange that most of the pictures in the game and most of the faces of the people when you're communicating through radio, their faces are artistic representations of their faces rather than an actual computer model or a computer character. It's a little off and a little weird, but I just sort of got used to it. In the end, I really enjoyed Soma. I loved the story about it, and that's what really kept me going. The thing about games is I play them for the story rather than the gameplay. And sometimes you can have a really crappy gameplay, but a really great story, and I'll still play it over and over again. With that said, the gameplay really isn't that bad. It's just not as intense or as great, and some people might be disappointed with the gameplay, especially if you've played other survival horror games like Outlast, Alien Isolation, or Amnesia. Soma is not on the same level of those games when it comes to gameplay. Soma is also about as long as Until Dawn is. It's about 6 to 8 hours. It depends on how much you explore, how long you've been stuck on some puzzles, but like I said, it's about 6 to 8 hours roughly. Maybe a little more. And it really helps that Soma is only about 30 to 40 bucks on PlayStation Network. I'm not sure the exact price because I got a discount for being a PlayStation Plus member, but I think it's around 30 to 40 bucks. It's either $29.99 or $39.99. I can't remember which. So that might help because it's not the same price as a full game. Ultimately, I'm going to give Soma 8.5 out of 10 because video games I'm going to do a 10 scale rather than a 5 scale. So have you played Soma? What did you think about it? Go ahead and comment. If you haven't, what is your favorite survival horror game? There's way too many to think of, and so if I'm going to think of survival horror games that are first person, it would either have to be Alien Isolation or Outlast for me. Thanks for watching, guys. This is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.